Sahana bhavatu, sahanau bhunaktu, saha viryam karavavahai, tejasvinavaditam astu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May we work together with great energy. May our studies be illumined. May we not unnecessarily cavil with each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. So we are studying, of course, the science of religion. And when we talk about religion these days, most people are thinking of religions in the plural. And so this is not what we mean by the science of religion. And of course, what I mentioned earlier was, we really are studying Raja Yoga. And there Swami Vivekananda calls this the science of religion. On what basis? We can discuss that, but first of all, there was a question about the corrupt and corruptibility of religions per se. And that, of course, when religions gain power, or priests within it gain power, or temples or churches gain money and status, they become powerful. Why? Because naturally the human element is there. And we're talking, when we talk of the science of religion, we're talking of the human element in a different way. We're talking about the human possibilities of every individual. So Swami Vivekananda gives a wonderful expose of this in his introduction to the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. Just to remind you, this Raja Yoga, if you're studying it along with me from week to week, is divided into two sections. An explanatory section in the beginning, and then Patanjali Yoga Sutras with its commentaries derived from the ancient commentators. It's a very small book, and yet every word is pregnant with meaning. It's a profound treatise, there's no doubt, as we would accept with any scientific treatise. But you see, when we talk about religions, we're talking about what Swami Vivekananda is calling secondary details. Is there any need for a building? There are some people who say it's much better to do worship for buildings made from flesh and blood rather than cement and mortar or bricks and mortar. But it is useful and helpful for some. When we study the early days of Christianity, for the first 250, 300 years, the Christians were humble, simple people. It seemed like they were sharing everything in community. They had no power. They seemed to be in the minority from the start in the Greco-Roman world. They were simply a sect. They gained a reputation of being non-cooperative with the state. In other words, their monotheism had put something in the way of emperor worship, naturally. And emperor worship was seen to be a national rallying cry. It was the cohesive thing. It was equivalent to treachery if you did not support the Roman emperor as somebody who after death was destined to join all the other gods and was a god in his own right. And there was a tremendous amount of religious liberation and tolerance. You could worship any kind of god you liked. In fact, every city had its own favorite gods, its own favorite deities. But you see, the Greek pantheon was inherited by the Roman pantheon, and these gods were people who fought among each other a little bit. They were almost like humans, but they were superhumans. We have the same thing in the Vedic religions. In the Vedic gods, the same thing. Indra was the chief of all the deities associated with the sky and anything that happened in the sky, thunder, rainfall, and was always the conqueror of Vrita, the archenemy, who was against all this harmony, against rainfall. And so Indra was responsible for the welfare of all beings. As time goes on, though, Indra's behavior lets him down. There's corruption in heaven itself. And Indra now is known for his various sexual exploits and his human characteristics and so on and so forth. And he's demoted. And another deity, Vishnu, reigns supreme. So religion is, in that sense, is an evolutionary process. It has to adapt to the changes. But you see, if there's something solid behind it, if there's some inner experience behind it, then this kind of religion will survive like a river flowing eternally. But it will change its course over time. Like melting snow in the Alps or something like that, or the Himalayas, you'll find glaciers forming. But as climate changes, as time goes on, then the glacial formation takes a turn, takes a change. And some of the glaciers today are melting at a very extraordinary rapid rate. So it's the same river that is flowing, but has to adapt to contemporary needs. Now, along with that adaptation is a balance. When Christianity started from its humble beginnings, it then gained support. It gained support from Constantine, the emperor. He made it the state religion. But then subsequently, his successors made it not just the state religion, but banned every other religion, made an exclusiveness. And this is where the exclusiveness within that religion started. Previously, it wasn't exclusivism. It was extremely tolerant of every other position. But it had a clear position. That's what distinguished it. It had a distinguishing characteristic about it. And then, ultimately, when you get royal patronage, and you'll find it in early Christianity, but you'll also find it in Buddhism in India, royal patronage makes all the difference. Then you can afford to build glorious churches and temples with this royal patronage. And in Christianity's case, you have King Constantine, emperor, taking over religious disputes and making a direct formulation, having the great councils that were there that formulated theology in the face of alternative disputes about the nature of Christ, something that was enormously controversial amongst those who were Jewish people. Jewish people, they would never dream, and still don't dream, of having a God incarnate. This is more part of the Greco-Roman world. I'm not saying that it's not good, because it gave a depth to the theology. And when you, in the history of India, you see Buddhism's popularity and its decline, and Hindus' popularity, and in some areas its decline, it was largely because of royal patronage. Now we can't have royal patronage without an element of politics. And political power starts taking over, not because there's anything wrong with the principles of the religion, but because there's something wrong with the people. Because people are people after all. And as long as people have an element of power and greed and so on, this corruption comes in. The same thing happened, you see, in the Eastern Christian Church. In the Eastern Catholic Church there, which was essentially all their liturgy was in Greek, as opposed to the Western Christian Church, where the liturgy was increasingly in Latin. There was a natural division. And in Constantinople, the Roman emperor was there supportive, mainly of the Byzantine tradition. But that switched, and it switched with political power, with land ownership, until it was necessary not just to be acknowledged as the first among equals, but the only decision maker. And this comes in a controversial part of the Christian creed called the filioque clause. whose objection was, who told you could put this in? No, I'm the Pope, I can do it. If you study all these religions, you will see that they started off in a small, humble way, and the basis of their religion was always personal experience. This is what Swami Vivekananda points out, that when it comes to evidence, we have to take into account the subtle evidence from those who experience something different. In his chapter on the introduction to Patanjali Yoga Sutras, we will see that the scientific approach toward all of these things must be that there is an absolute somewhere. And you cannot have, when you look at all the observational evidence in the universe, you cannot have a linear thing. There has to be a cyclical thing. Birth, life, death, birth, life, death. Galaxy is formed. It dissolves back into its original nebula. It's the nature of things. A seed develops into a tree. It loses its seed characteristics and takes on a tree characteristic. Something always gets lost. Something dies. Something from it is born. That again dies. The cycle continues. So if you want to approach these matters in a scientific way, then we have to take into account even the science of Swami Vivekananda's day, which was purely logical. A logical methodology. And as long as we are concerned with the structure of that and revere the mystical source of it as evidence, we now start to match it with our own internal journey, the practice of it. The principle of it is practice of it. In Patanjali Yoga Sutras, the first section, 4 chapters are there, let's call it the first chapter, is all on the principles. And then it's on the practice. And then it's on the effects. And then it's on the ultimate goal, the ultimate conclusion. These are the 4 logical steps that we need to take. We must understand what are the principles. Like any other scientific endeavor, we start off with understanding, well, there's some kind of fundamental hypothesis going on. It seems reasonable. Now, when you take the scientific endeavor as it was in Swami Vivekananda's day, you see there's no different to our day. Because if you take that everything has to be traced back to an absolute, the next question is the absolute better than the relative? You know, if you take away all of the characteristics of the relative world, what do you have? Do you have a nothingness? You have something like a rock that has no characteristics. If you take away mind, have you taken away any meaningful thing that we are used to? And so that's one approach. Another approach, Swami Vivekananda points out, is the idea that maybe there's just a continuation of this life after death, so that good and bad are weighed up, a plus and minus of business, but that doesn't take us any further. It takes us to the same condition of earthliness. It doesn't improve our condition. And if we seem to be going somewhere, this doesn't solve our problem. It means we went nowhere. So in this, heaven is discounted. Now let's come back to religion as we commonly understand it, as a series of doctrines and dogmas where people postulate a heaven. It's a nice idea, but from a scientific point of view, it doesn't work. And Swami Vivekananda lays out very clearly the logic of why that wouldn't work. And so if there is some kind of direction to this, and there's a cyclical pattern that is being seen, and the law of nature is constant everywhere, and what we see in one circumstance, we will see everywhere in other circumstances, then we would have to take into account the idea that we come from something and we're journeying and we're going towards something. And what we call life is just an interim period. So with small children, that's how we put it. Life is a journey. See, we come from God and we go to God. What was our origin, we have to go back to, because we're not observing linear progression. We're observing cyclical progression. And I think this is one of the difficulties in so-called modern science in terms of biology, in terms of cosmology. The question is, where are we all going? I always remember in the days of political difficulty in what was formerly Rhodesia, everyone got stickers and put them on their car. And I remember one sticker saying, "You're behind me, I'm behind Ian Smith, where the heck are we going?" So we don't know, you see, unless we can figure out. And the only way we can know is from these intimate, mystical, internal experiences of those individuals that revolutionized and changed the whole world. If we talk about Christianity, we have to say, what was the characteristics of a Christ? If we talk about Buddhism, what were the characteristics of a Buddha? If we talk about Hinduism or Vedic religion, what was the characteristic of the rishis? What is the characteristic of various saints that affirmed the truths of the Vedic people and the rishis? And they all have to be consistent, because if you make a scientific experiment, it doesn't matter where you are, you can make independent experiments and then compare your findings. And if the data and the result is different, then we say something is wrong somewhere. We have to start again. It can't be the same experiment was done in China and another one done in Mexico, and identical experiments, and the result came out differently. We know then that something is wrong. So in conjunction with our study, I'm picking up a book here called The Imprisoned Splendor. It's a book I've read many, many years ago, and it's a very old book. But it does respond to Swami Vivekananda's observation in the beginning that in the world of science, scientists are culpable if they do not investigate phenomena. And Reynold Johnson, the author of this book, has endeavored to do it even as far back as the 1950s. This book was first published in 1953, but the findings are still valid. And the book has various sections. And he's a scientist. But he's bold enough to say, I don't know about these phenomena, and maybe we should investigate. And maybe we should record our investigations for all posterity. And I always remember the first immature question that I had with a very revered monk in Zimbabwe, Rhodesia as it was then. And my question was, oh, about this telepathy, is it real? I was interested in all these things, Never mind about spirituality. And patiently, he didn't sideline my question and say, no, don't worry about that, think about God or something like that. He said, no, he said, you see, there's only one broadcasting station, there's only one broadcast universal, there's only one cosmic mind. It's like a broadcasting station. And we have local transmitters. Now you'll see me using this in my talks, isn't it? The same thing, because I learned from there many, many years ago. In the early 1960s, I was 15 and he was probably 70. So he said, you see, if two people tune in to the same wavelength, naturally they'll get the same broadcast. That made a world of sense to me. That was logical. Now, can we experimentally verify it and so on? So it's the next thing, but at least we can investigate it. And so the first part is the data of natural science. And there he talks about the macrocosm and the microcosm, and he talks about patterns in life and the idea that it cannot be meaningless, there must be a purpose. Forget about this linear aspect. The purpose is subtle, because there's a circle or cycle. That's what we observe. He talks about Homo sapiens. We can say more accurately Homo sapiens sapiens. He talks about towards a philosophy of science. And all this is covered in his first section, and all with data, way back then. And then his second part is the data of psychical research. Once we've dealt with the natural physical phenomena, let's go to the next level and go to psychical research. Research, bear in mind. And behold, what is his first chapter? Telepathy and clairvoyance. Exactly my question I'm answering. And he goes through what are the datas, what are the personal stories being told, how can we investigate this? And of course, this is 1950s. But in more recent times, there have been research on this. You get somebody independently, two people in different rooms, you get somebody to draw a picture, and you say to the other person, okay, this person has drawn a picture, now you please describe what you are thinking or picking up, and put conditions in such a way that they will be focused on it. And the way you ensure that is you measure the one person's brain waves and see if that can be duplicated in the other person, or even the duplication of in terms of sound is translated, and a person picks that up, and then we see what happens from there. And one occasion will not be enough. You have to repeat it until you have enough data that makes any sense. And so precognition, retrocognition, object reading or psychometry, apparitions and hauntings, experience outside the body, materializations, psychokinesis, poltergeist phenomena, the complex structure of man, survival of death, the problem. All of these he openly discusses and makes experiments for. And the part 3, the data of mystical experience, because you can see progressively from the natural phenomena of the physical, now go into the world of the mental, now go into the world of inner mystical experience. And he talks about the types of mystical experience, the interpenetrations of mystical experience, imperishable things. And a chapter, interesting enough, to each his way, and finalizes it, caps it off with a very important part, the significance of the whole, not the significance of the parts. And I talked previously about the great scientist David Bohm, and he said, it won't make any sense. None of this scientific research about the physical universe will make any sense in trying to reconcile quantum physics, or a theory of everything where the quantum mechanics and the general relativity are ultimately reconciled. And currently, the standard model, the cosmological model, is called the lambda cold dark matter model, and it incorporates a Big Bang explosion somewhere that postulates a singularity, and nobody knows what it is. Because at that point, all of Einstein's general relativity is so reliably proven everywhere and so reliably worked out, suddenly breaks down at this point, and we have to look for a new physics. And the honest answer any astrophysicist will say is, at this point, we don't know. We don't really even know exactly what is happening and how it develops. And maybe the James Webb telescope will find us something new, but it was only designed to see so far with great, great clarity, no doubt. So we are dealing with all the parts and particulars of the universe, and David Bohm says, no, you have to look at the whole. And he produces this understanding of holism, relate everything to the whole. And he was broad-minded enough to try to understand this from this mystical point of view. And so he had many, many conversations with his friend Krishnamurti. And Krishnamurti was remarkable because he brought the Eastern perspective to modern questions. He was thoughtful about it and humble about it. And he used to really rail against the exaggerated exhibitionist teachers that we may find today, and we probably found from the 1960s onwards anyway, because he was just an ordinary person having ordinary conversations, but the depth of his experience was valid. You may recall that Krishnamurti was destined to become famous by the Theosophists, who saw some kind of Messiah figure in him, and ultimately he left them, understanding, no, I want to independently find the truth. This doesn't seem, to be a reasonable thing to be involved, to mix up things in what we now understand as New Age phenomena. And so, what is the significance of the whole is an important section. And there he talks about pre-existence, reincarnation, karma, the purpose of human life. One remarkable thing that he says in that chapter is the only thing you can make any sense of this, the only principle is the principle of the Oriental concept of lila, that it is a game. To say anything different means we really have no understanding. We can't find any significance in anything. So this is how he ties everything together. And so we can take, of course, random sections from this book as we go on from week to week and discover what his understanding, his investigative understanding of these various phenomena are. But you see, all of these, in a way, will be deviating from the central theme. Central theme laid out by Swami Vivekananda. Each soul is potentially divine, and the goal is to manifest this from within. And yes, there are means to do it, and yes, it's important to understand the geography of the mind and the functionality of different departments of the mind. Otherwise, how will you control it? So that is important. So I intend to jump a little bit and go back and forth. And here in the introduction to the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, he says this. Before going into the yoga aphorisms, I shall try to discuss one great question upon which rests the whole theory of religion for the yogis. It seems the consensus of opinion of the great minds of the world, and it has been nearly demonstrated by researchers into physical nature, that we are the outcome and manifestation of an absolute condition, back of our present relative condition, and are going forward to return to that absolute. That is why even today in modern science, physicists are talking about monism. And this, of course, comes from Einstein's understanding that the whole world you can resolve into pure energy. But of course, energy is of different types. What is energy? The yogis described what is energy by postulating its existence and its effects, and then how to control it. The control of it is called pranayama, control of energy. So if this is true, that we want to find out an absolute, that is a generalized condition that sits at the back of everything, something like a substance. And in the microcosmic world of scientific research, they're trying to find it in primordial elements until finally they've come to a conclusion. At the bottom of everything are quantum fields. Don't ask what they are. These are areas where things appear and disappear, where electrons come borrowing energy and time from the future and get immediately annihilated by antiparticles, such as positrons, and going to nothing. But it doesn't explain why we have a universe, because on those grounds, we should not have a universe consisting of matter. Where's the antimatter? So this becomes a problem. So the search for the absolute is there in modern science. It was so in his day, and it's so today as well. You want a theory of everything. You want to find that ultimate absolute. And the absolute by its very nature is different from the relative. And the absolute will be beyond the scope of anything. And so, this being granted, the question is, which is better, the absolute or this state? There are not wanting people who think that the manifested state is the highest state of man. This manifested state is the highest state of man. Thinkers of great caliber are of the opinion that we are not manifestations of undifferentiated being, and the differentiated state is higher than the absolute. In other words, materialist reductionists. They imagine that in the absolute there cannot be any quality, that it must be insensate, dull, and lifeless, that only this life can be enjoyed, and therefore we must cling to it. Now, this idea has come out in neo-atheism today, and I think most people have heard of the famous zoologist professor Richard Dawkins, evolutionary biologist, who's written some significant biological works. Unfortunately, they're now out of date and not really very important or valid, but in the 1970s expounded neo-Darwinian position on evolution and brought out a book called The Selfish Gene. Wonderfully written book, and but not really relevant. Things have moved on since then. But you see, he would grant, okay, so if you go back, you'll find something simple. If there is a God, and he will use this word, God delusion. If there is a God, then that cannot be, it must be something very simple, where we get all the complexity of life from. That absolute cannot be complex. It cannot have any parts. And therefore it must be dull and stupid, not intelligent. That's his argument. And so this is a new argument, but even Vivekananda would have come across this in his day also. And so he says, first of all, and of course, if that's all that exists, then cling to life, clinging to life there. And if you take it to extreme, be a hedonist. There's no need for morals and ethics. There was a philosophical school in India called Charvaka that reigned for some time, maybe 1,000 years. It was one of the philosophers of India. The broadness, the broad-mindedness and the tolerance of the continent of India never changed or criticized it, allowed it debate and so on, even though it ridiculed the whole of religion and also said there's no afterlife, there's no karma, it's all nonsense. And therefore, what is my conclusion? Morals and ethics, then we need not have anything such as this. We can only have utilitarianism or consequentialism. Do what makes you happy, eat, drink, and be merry. Be hedonistic. And so that was there then, and you might find theoretically it's there now, except, of course, the atheists of today will say, no, we must have good moral behavior. But there's no reason for it. Why should I not do the worst if it suits my purpose? Why should I have any kind of noble sentiment in my human personality? So he goes on to say, first of all, we want to inquire into other solutions of life. And there was an old solution that man after death remained the same, that all his good sides, minus his evil sides, remain forever. A kind of life balance, you see. So we weigh you. In afterlife, you go onto some cosmic scales, and if it weighs toward hell, well, you're in trouble. If it weighs toward heaven, it's okay. And maybe there's a balance between the two, and then what will you do? Then you have to have a theology called purgatory. So, logically stated, that means that man's goal is the world. This world carried a stage higher, because in this world, good is necessary and evil is necessary. You cannot have one without the other. And so, eliminated of its evils in the state they call heaven, this theory, on the face of it, is absurd and puerile. Because it cannot be. There cannot be good without evil, nor evil without good. You cannot have a state of pure good. There must be a contraposition to it. Otherwise, how will you know what is good? And so, to live in a world where it is all good and no evil is what Sanskrit logicians call a dream in the air. It's not a possibility. It's an ideal, no doubt. Another theory in modern times has been presented by several schools that man's destiny is to go on always improving, always struggling towards, but never reaching the goal. And he's talking really about, in his day, the modern theory of evolution as it was in his time. This statement, though apparently very nice, is also absurd because there's no such thing as motion in a straight line. There was somebody who said, I live in fear. Why? I went to Australia and threw a boomerang and it never came back yet. So you see, it goes in a cycle. He says, every motion is in a circle. If you can take up a stone and project it into space and then live long enough, that stone, if it meets with no obstruction, will come back exactly to your hand. That's why we see regularly, we see comets. We can predict when the next comet is coming. That is why we see things in a pattern of birth, life, and death. There's a definite cycle to it. A straight line, infinitely projected, must end in a circle. Therefore, this idea that the destiny of man is progressing ever forward and never stopping is absurd. And although extraneous to the subject, I may remark that this idea explains the ethical theory that you must not hate and must love, because whatever you do comes back to you. It's a boomerang effect. Eventually, it'll come back to you. So there's a practical utility in moral and ethical behavior. Because, just as in the case of electricity, the one theory is that the power leaves the dynamo and completes the circle back to the dynamo. So with hate and so with love, they must come back to the source. Therefore, do not hate anybody, because that hatred which comes out from you must, in the long run, come back to you. If you love, that love will come back to you, completing the circle. It's as certain as can be that every bit of hatred that goes out of the heart of a man comes back to him in full force. Nothing can stop it. Similarly, every impulse of love comes back to him. Now, if you take this as a strategy, it'll work against you as well. It's just a principle giving you a rationale for good behavior. But you see, if you say, oh, I don't want all that on me, then that also is set up as a thought, which carries an egocentricity with a certain level of tension. So, on other and practical grounds, we see that the theory of eternal progression is untenable, for destruction is the goal of everything earthly. All our struggles and hopes and fears and joys, what will they lead to? We shall all end in death. Nothing is so certain as this. Where then is this motion in a straight line, this infinite progression? It is only going out to a distance and coming back to the center from which it started. See how from nebulae the sun, moon, and stars are produced. Then they dissolve and go back to nebulae. This is the reason why we see various suns as dwarfs and ultimately supernova, where the collapse of celestial bodies are there, and also the birth of celestial bodies is also there. We see vast pockets, new pockets of hydrogen gas, more than enough to make the whole universe. The same is being done everywhere. The plant takes material from the earth, dissolves, and gives it back. Every form in this world is taken out of our surrounding atoms and goes back to these atoms. And we see this in the quantum world of quantum fields. Things appear and things go back. What I like to call the Guinness effect. See, because in a Guinness you have a big foam on the top. And it was John Wheeler that called this term quantum foam. So all these bubbles are coming up and disappearing again. You can imagine it like this. It cannot be that the same law acts differently in different places. This is a great lesson. You cannot say that there's one law. There are two laws, one for the microcosm, one for the macrocosm. Scientists know this and are uncomfortable that there seem to be two contradictory laws going on. Somebody will resolve it at some point in time. And law is uniform. Nothing is more certain than that. If this is the law of nature, it also applies to thought. Thought will dissolve and go back to its origin. Where we will it or not, whether we will it or not, we shall have to return. We shall have to return to our origin. And now he uses a religious term in the science of religion, and he's not shy to do it. He says, our origin, which is called God or absolute. So what is God in this sense? It is not the theological God. It's not the God that appears as a Trinity. It's not God who sits in judgment. It's not God a creator. It's God an absolute. Absolute and God, he's equating in the same breath. So what is this absolute? Can you think of an absolute? As soon as you think of it, it's no longer absolute. We all came from God, and we're all bound to go back to God. Call that by any name you like. We shouldn't argue over the name. God, absolute or nature, the fact remains the same, from whom all this universe comes out, in whom all that is born lives, and to whom all returns. It's a Upanishadic quotation. This is one fact that is certain. Nature works on the same plan. What is being worked out in one sphere is repeated in millions of spheres. And you may say, well, that's an axiom only. We don't know whether we should accept it or not. But general relativity is built on it. When we see something happening locally, we extrapolate it and apply it to the whole universe, test it out, and it works. So what you see, he says, with the planets, the same will it be with the earth, with men, and with all. The huge wave is a mighty compound of small waves. And it may be of millions. The life of the whole world is a compound of millions of little lives. And the death of the whole world is the compound of the deaths of these millions of little beings. What a wonderful, holistic way of looking at things. See, no matter what we see as a unit, we can see it's actually made up of small individual things, but together is a compound. Let us take, for example, a wave. We can break it down into small eddies and currents. A little foam here, something else there. We can see its characteristic of rising or falling, but we know that it is made up of small molecules. And these molecules are made up of atoms. And the atoms themselves are broken down into quantum fields. And that's all we have. But the whole thing is one and the same. You can't divorce any one of these views from the whole. So David Bohm has this expression, the implicit and the explicit. What we see is the explicit, but underneath it is a potential called implicit, and it's moving itself forward and expressing itself. and subsiding back into its origin. Exactly the same thing. It is he who has a very feasible theory or interpretation of the double slit difficulty, the wave-particle duality difficulty exhibited in an old experiment called Young's double slit experiment. That is, that when you project small particles, photons, electrons, through two slits, you would expect them to come out on a sensitized wall. You'd expect them, or screen, you'd expect them to come out in columns, divided by where the slits had an interference, that is, slits had something in between. Like baseballs, you throw the baseball, it either goes in through left slit or right slit, or bounces off in the center. And what you see on the scintillating screen behind it will be a pattern. So many balls went to the left, so many went to the right, and there's a gap in the middle. Nothing arrives. But what do they find? This is the query. And you've probably seen it in videos or what have you, and explanations. You'll find what is called interference pattern. In other words, the electron or whatever particle is going through, because individual ones are shot through, will now go through both slits simultaneously and interfere with themselves and appear in a particular way, but with a wave formation on the scintillating screen. And then if you try to examine, no, let me see definitively which slit did this particle go through. And you make sure you fire the particles individually, spaced well, and you still find there's an interference pattern when you do that, except when you look at it. And when you measure it, you see on the scintillating screen, it behaves exactly as it should. It behaves like a particle. This is called the wave-particle duality. And it's a problem of how it works that has not been solved. The only thing that we do know is there's an observer involved, but observer is not necessarily a conscious observer. It's anything that is interfering and reducing or making the wave behave like a particle so that we can measure it. Of course, it's no surprise to those people who study Einstein's special relativity, and if they agree that space and time are opposites, then what we are seeing when we see the wave aspect, we're seeing the space dimension. And when we try and fix it, we're seeing the time dimension. But David Bohm has a pilot wave theory. So he says, no, what we call a wave function is not just mathematical. There's a wave that is carrying the particle. The particle is surfing on the wave, as it were. That is why you see waves and particles on the scintillating screen. And that's a theory, that's an interpretation, which will require a lot more mathematics, because you then have to add a whole new energy called a wave. And we don't have the physics for it. And it also introduces some problems in terms of what we call quantum entanglement and various things. Never mind, the whole idea is this. Fundamentally, there are waves. And even physicists that have different interpretations will understand, yes, what we find appearing in quantum packets in individual things actually are waves, but when we look at them, they're particles. So as seen by us, they're particles, and yet they are waves. So this phenomena is tied up with all the theories in quantum physics, such as Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And the calculations are made with a wave function, so we can estimate with reasonableness where the particle landed. So the point is, these are in compound form. We can see the holistic dimension of this. And we cannot see the particular form because it has a different meaning when we see it. You put it in a different way. When you watch a pixelated screen and study the pixels, you won't get a sense of the whole picture, the totality. Only when you stand back and see that these are part and parcel They're interwoven into meaningful totality that can be seen. Only then will you understand the meaning and purpose of it. So Swami Vivekananda is saying the same thing, and he says, now the question arises, is going back to God the higher state or not? The philosophers of the yoga school emphatically answer that it is. They say that man's present state is a degeneration of the original state, the absolute. There is no one religion on the face of the earth which says that man is an improvement. The idea is that his beginning is perfect and pure. In the language of Jesus, is your inheritance. Kingdom of heaven is within you. That he degenerates until he cannot degenerate any further, and that there must come a time when he shoots upward again to complete the circle. And you can put it also in individual terms, where a person goes into the depths of depression or depravity or a state of hopelessness or helplessness. Having reached rock bottom, nature has a way then of inspiring him upwards. So the circle must be described. The circle must complete its journey and meet its end. And however low he may go, he must ultimately take the upward bend and not go back in the original source. And when you look at a circle, you can see it as a number of different curves. At the bottom, you can see, if supposing you insert a ball bearing, it'll go like this and maybe settle. But life has a momentum that says, no, move on around the circle. Go from a state of inertia to a state of activity. Convert potential into kinetic energy. That's the idea of it. So man comes from God in the beginning. In the middle, he becomes man. And in the end, he goes back to God. This is the method of putting it in the dualistic form, where there's a God and there's a me. The monistic form, that is that there are no two, is that man is God and goes back to him again, or more accurately, the realization of it again. If our present state is the higher one, then why is there so much horror and misery, and why is there an end to it? And if this is the higher state, why does it end? That which corrupts and degenerates cannot be the highest state. Why should it be so diabolical, so unsatisfying? It is only excusable inasmuch as through it we are taking a higher groove. We have to pass through it in order to become regenerate again. Put a seed into the ground and it disintegrates, dissolves after a time, and out of that dissolution comes the splendid tree. Every soul must disintegrate to become God. We have to dissemble all this consciousness of an embodied being. So it follows that the sooner we get out of this state we call man, the better for us. Is it by committing suicide that we get out of this state? Not at all. That will make it worse. That would be the atheistic position. Torturing ourselves or condemning the world is not the way to get out. We have to pass through the slough of despond. Slough meaning is like a snake. We have to take off the skin, slough it off. And the sooner we are through, the better. It must always be remembered that man's state is not the highest state. So he's really addressing the evolutionary theory that, okay, after going through so much evolution, so much changes, and now with the modern theory of DNA to see, okay, we all have the same DNA. It's not that man was created in one moment and something else created in the next. We see a fossil record that shows a gradual change as we see in speciation and development and so on until we arrive as man. We have no problem with this, except of course that there is a period of acceleration, accelerated evolution, which wasn't found in Swami Vivekananda's day. In other words, even if you accept it as a linear progression, it is more like a slow progression as required by Darwin. And then a spurt called the Cretaceous period, where everything happens and all the species arrive. And then a kind of slowing down again, where those species now start being nurtured and surviving more. So that state of man is not the highest state of evolution. The final state of evolution is God, the absolute. The really difficult part to understand, he says, is that this state, the absolute, which has been called the highest, is not, as some fear, that of the zoophyte or of the stone. According to them, there are only two states of existence, one of the stone and the other of thought. What right have they to limit existence to these two? Is there not something infinitely superior to thought? The vibrations of light, when they are very low, we don't see. When they come a little bit more intense, they become light to us. We only have the visible spectrum to deal with. Same with sound. Ultrasonic and supersonic, we have no access to ordinarily. When they become still more intense, we do not see them. It's dark to us. In the darkness, in the end, the same darkness is in the beginning. Certainly not. They're different as the two poles. Is the thoughtlessness of the stone the same as the thoughtlessness of God? Certainly not. God does not think, does not reason. Why should he? Is anything unknown to him that he should reason? The stone cannot reason. God does not. Such is the difference. These philosophers think it is awful if we go beyond thought. They find nothing beyond thought. There's an example, you see. A devotee and God, they come to a river, and the river is a torrential river, and they can't easily cross it. And so the devotee says, "Oh Lord, please design and construct a bridge." And the Lord said, "What's the need for that? In one moment we can be across." So this idea of design theory and everything, there's no necessity. Why should God be a designer? So that's the point. So that leads us now, of course, to 9 o'clock. And we commenced our study this evening by studying the introduction to the Patanjali Yoga Sutras. And although we have not made a linear progression in our study, and if we follow in the regular kind of format way, we would be going to first steps. But I feel that if we are to study the science of religion, we should study this introduction first, because all the possibilities of logic are presented to us and gives us the basis of the science of religion itself. Now, when we think of religion in a different way, such as visiting a temple or getting involved in commercial religion, as we might call it, you see, it's up to you how you take it and whether you require it and whether you need it. So these are no doubt all assistances and helps, but the profound statement always has to be repeated that churches, temples, books, doctrines, dogmas are but secondary details. They're not the primary thing. And if they're useful to you, then it's a question of what your input is. So I always tell people of when I was in Calcutta and I visited for the first time Kali Ghat. And I went with a brahmachari at the time, and his first argument was about paying for shoes, storage, and so on. I said, never mind, don't worry. But then you see, he was pushing and shoving to get a certain darshana, and people have different reasons for getting darshana. But then when it came to the critical point, and the Brahmin said, well, you see, there are two boxes here. you can put 200 rupees in this, you'll get a curse. Or you can put 2,000 in this and you'll get abundance. As soon as I heard it, I said, please tell him, we are sadhus, we are monks, we're not afraid of curses and we have no need for abundance, we won't give anything. And so you see, and that changed the whole attitude actually, because they went and fetched garlands and what have you, you know. I suppose they had never come across such an unusual argument. So in every pilgrimage site, you'll find this level of corruption, where you'll find wind-up plastic Virgin Marys in Rome, and buy it at a cost, and where you'll find people of varying degrees of interest. Some, they want some kind of benefit from their visit. Others want an increase in their knowledge. Sri Krishna gives us these alternatives in the Bhagavad Gita. Some people are desperate. They want an improvement in their condition. They want to get out of a tight spot. Other people just want a general improvement. Other people want more knowledge. But the fourth, they are doing their worship for the sake of worship. And these are my most beloved devotee. All are dear to me, says he. But these are most because there's no motive for it. So when we go to these pilgrimage sites and so on and go through these experiences, we have to weigh up what is our internal condition and how we respond. And very often, the spiritual quality that you have is in dealing with the situation as well. All right, we'll finish off there. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Thanks.
Can you explain the last sentence again? The spiritual quality that we...
Oh, yes. Well, if you're faced with a difficult situation, supposing I want, to visit the mother at Kali Ghat. Now, if somebody pushes me and shoves me, of course, I could stand back and say, oh, well, but you see, I'm a sadhu. Why are you doing this? And actually, my reaction is to slow down. Just to be otherwise a little bit. But you see, God is not just in that mother that you see. It's in all the sea of humanity as well. And if you miss that point, you see, then you miss the whole lesson. Yes, every awkward situation is a potential lesson for you. How will I control my reaction and get the best out of the situation? How will I get darshana and the best out of the situation in an awkward situation? If I can't do it in an awkward situation, then there's something wrong with my way of dealing with things. If I think the only way I can satisfactorily deal with things is when everything is going well, life has a different opinion. It roots us out of a rut and says, no, here's an awkward situation, please play the game. And I always use the analogy of tennis, give me the awkward ball, please. Otherwise, what use is the game? Make it a game, please. Make it a sport. Make it worthwhile. So there's an unnamed participant, a great rugby person. You know who you are, of course. And at what some people would consider to be, a senior person, a senior citizen, and still playing rugby. But you see, of what value is it if there's no opposition player? And if there's no strategy from the other side, and if you don't have a strategy, and if you leave your skills to one side, and if you don't practice, if you don't know how to pass a ball, and you don't know how to manage things in a scrum or something, and you are not prepared to take any knocks or tackles, and you say, I think I can kick the ball over the posts, but if you remove the posts, and it'll be okay. You can't play a game like that. And we take that as a sport. Now, the minute you don't take it as sport, it's called soccer hooliganism. People rip up stadiums because they attack. It's warfare. It's no longer a sport. So it's wonderful to be put in these difficult situations. We interpret it as difficult. Remove the word difficult. remove the concept of difficulty and say, this is a divine game. Let me play it. Let me play it well.
And would, in terms of the lessons from Vivekananda, we would get the impression that, as he says, that we're all on our way to an absolute condition.
Yes, because it's our nature.
It's in our nature.
Yeah.
Then why would he say each soul has the potential to be defined?
Because the insertion of the word potential is that we don't know it.
We don't know.
If you knew it, then your goal is achieved.
Right. That's very clever.
Yeah.
That's very. I've been at this for 3 weeks now, trying to find out what does that actually mean.
Yeah.
And that does make sense.
Yeah. So a seed has the potential to be a tree, but the tree is in the seed already.
Father of the tree.
It's just in a different form. That's all. Okay, good. All right, good. Thank you.